You were by her elbow while she wrung every last drop of flavor from a ham bone, a can of salmon, the cloudy potlikker left after the greens went quiet, filing it all away without knowing it was a lesson. Here are 30 cheap meals African American grandmas made that nobody could replicate. Crackling bread started with the parts of the hog most people never thought to save. The skin and trim fat rendered down until they turned golden and crunchy, releasing grease into the pan. That grease went straight into the cornmeal batter. The cracklings folded in warm, softening the batter just enough before it hit the iron. The iron had to be blazing, hot enough to hiss on contact and form a crust before the inside could steam through. You didn't stir it. You waited for the edges to pull away from the sides, and that pull was your signal. Crackling bread had roots in West African cooking traditions where nothing from the hog ever went to waste, and that philosophy traveled into every Black Southern kitchen that followed without ever needing to be written down. The cornbread that came out was richer than anything made with butter, with a salty, smoky crunch woven through every bite. Nobody measured the cracklings. You poured until the batter looked right, and you knew it looked right because someone had shown you. The potlikker was never the leftover, it was the whole point. After a mess of greens simmered for hours with a ham bone or salt pork, what remained was a dark, potent broth, tangy with vinegar and rich with pork fat, carrying every mineral the greens had surrendered to the water. George Key, born enslaved in Arkansas, described meals of greens and potlikker as daily sustenance, and that tradition carried forward unbroken for more than a century. You tore off a piece of cornbread and dropped it in, or you tipped the pot and drank from a cup. Some households saved their potlikker like stock poured into jars. For the week, stirred into dried beans, used to start the next pot of greens. The broth served as a healing remedy too, given to sick children when solid food felt like too much. What wealthier kitchens threw away, these households turned into medicine and into the richest thing on the table. The can of pink salmon cost next to nothing, and it came with every bit of the fish, including the soft, edible bones that Grandma mashed right in because those bones were calcium and she wasn't throwing calcium away. The salmon got flaked into a bowl, mixed with cornmeal, a beaten egg, chopped onion, and black pepper, then shaped into patties with wet hands and laid into a skillet of hot grease. Cornmeal served as binding and crust at once, holding the patties together while crisping them gold on both sides. By the 1940s and 50s, canned salmon had become a staple protein in Black Southern households because it was affordable, shelf-stable, and asked nothing of you in terms of equipment. A single can fed 4 people with enough cornmeal to stretch it. What came out of that skillet had a crispy shell and a tender center, and it sat well on rice or beside dried beans. The recipe still exists. The woman who made it by feel, pressing each patty until it held without asking how, does not. Tomato gravy was what happened when there was no meat for drippings and no milk for white gravy, but there was always a can of tomatoes and bacon grease in the jar by the stove. You started with the fat, let it get hot, worked in a spoonful of flour, and stirred until the raw smell cooked off. The canned tomatoes went in next, crushed by hand over the pan, and the whole thing simmered down into something thick and rust-colored, seasoned with salt, pepper, and sometimes a pinch of sugar to cut the acid. It went over biscuits, over rice, over whatever bread was on the table. Through the Depression years and the lean stretches of the 1940s, this meal cost pennies per serving and appeared on Black Southern tables with the reliability of sunrise. It wasn't company food, it was Tuesday. And yet, people today who try to recreate it exactly, same can of tomatoes, same grease, same flour. Find something still comes out wrong. The flavor lived in the hands that made it and in the unhurried pace of the stirring, in the way she never rushed a roux because she had nowhere else to be. But years before that dish reached any holiday table, something simpler had been feeding families every weeknight. Stewed tomatoes spooned over plain white rice, made with whatever was in season or whatever was in the can. The tomatoes cooked down in a little fat with onion, salt, and black pepper until they lost their shape and became a thick, warm sauce. Poured over white rice, a small amount of flavor stretched across a large amount of food. In the rural South, this meal appeared when the week ran thin, cheap, fast, deeply filling, built from pantry staples that never ran out. The smell was sharp and sweet at once, the kind that settled into the walls of a kitchen. In the 1950s and 60s, as families moved north during the Great Migration, this meal traveled with them. Same tomatoes, same rice, same economy, and it showed up on Chicago and Detroit stovetops without missing a step. The bean pie didn't come from a Southern grandmother's kitchen. It came from something more deliberate. The Nation of Islam introduced it in the 1930s as a direct alternative to sweet potato pie, part of a broader push to shift African American eating habits toward foods the organization considered nutritious and self-sufficient. Navy beans were cooked down, sweetened, seasoned with nutmeg, cinnamon, and vanilla, and baked into a custard that tasted nothing like its name suggested. Smooth, faintly spiced, richer than anything made from dried beans had any right to be. By the 1950s and 60s, NOI mosques in Detroit, Chicago, Atlanta, and Los Angeles were selling bean pies from street tables out of the hands of young men in bow ties who moved through black neighborhoods as both vendors and community. If you grew up near a mosque or in a household the NOI had touched, you knew exactly what it was. If you hadn't, you might have gone your whole life never tasting one. The gap was deliberate. The pie belonged to the community that made it. The green tomatoes came off the vine when frost was close enough that waiting for them to ripen was no longer an option. Every garden had them, tomatoes that grew fat and firm but never turned red, and throwing them away was never considered. They got sliced thick, salted to draw out the water, then dredged in seasoned cornmeal and laid into hot grease. The cornmeal had to be coarse enough to hold and form a proper crust. Fine meal slid off and burned. The fat had to come halfway up each slice, and the heat had to be steady, too high, and the coating brown before the tomato softened beneath it. The finished slice was crisp outside and yielding in the middle, tangy and slightly bitter in a way ripe tomatoes never are. Most people who've eaten this have had a version, but not the version made from a tomato pulled an hour before it hit the skillet. That freshness changes everything. Dried beans were never the backup plan. They were the plan. Through the 1940s and 50s, a pound of navy beans or pintos could feed a large family for pennies and sit in the pantry through any emergency. The fatback went in with the soaked beans, not as something to eat, but as a seasoning, a thick slab of salt-cured pork fat that dissolved slowly into the broth over hours, releasing a smoky richness that made the beans taste far more complex than beans and water alone. In many black Southern households, this pot went on the stove early in the morning and didn't come off until supper. You stirred it when you passed. You added water when the level dropped. No timers, no thermometers, just attention and rhythm that could happen while other work was being done. The beans swelled and softened until the broth thickened naturally around them. The fatback gave body to every spoonful, and the beans gave protein and starch enough to quiet any hunger at the table. Built from almost nothing, it tasted like everything. Dirty rice earned its name from the color. Chicken livers and gizzards cooked down and folded into white rice turned the whole pot a speckled, deep brown that looked rough but tasted like one of the finest things a Louisiana kitchen ever made. The dish traced directly to Creole cooking traditions among black families in the bayou parishes, where the cheapest parts of the chicken, the organs, the necks, the backs, carried more flavor than the breasts and cost a fraction of the price. The livers went in first, cooked hard in oil with onion, celery, and bell pepper until dark and caramelized, then mixed through cooked white rice and seasoned with black pepper, cayenne, and thyme. The result was cheap to make, dense with iron and protein, and so deeply flavored it could hold a holiday table beside anything more expensive. People who grew up eating dirty rice understand that the organ meats are not a compromise. They are the point. Those parts carry the depth. Everything else is background. The skillet corn pudding sat somewhere between cornbread and a custard, denser than either, sweeter than what you ate with beans, richer than the foil pan version at Potlucks. It was cast iron food, a well-seasoned skillet heated in the oven until the fat shimmered, then batter poured over that heat so a crust formed from the bottom up before the top ever set. In season, kernels went in fresh, cut from the cob, and the cob scraped clean to release the milky liquid that made the pudding silky. The dish carried roots in both West African cooking traditions and Native American corn preparations that had exchanged hands across the Deep South over generations. At church suppers through the 1950s, it sat in the center of the spread without explaining itself. You either knew what you were tasting the moment it hit your mouth, or you didn't. If corn pudding was about patience and cast iron, what came next in many kitchens was about making something discarded into something you fought over. The smothered chicken wing, browned hard in the same cast iron before a roux built up in the drippings, the fat darkening with flour before onion went in, then stock, then the wings buried beneath it all to cook low and slow until the meat pulled from the bone without resistance. This was Depression-era method that stayed in these kitchens long after prosperity arrived. The practice of making a throwaway cut taste like it had been labored over all day because it had. By the 1960s, smothering was one of the only techniques that could transform the small yield of a wing into something that anchored a full plate. The gravy was what you came for, dark and silky, smelling of brown flour and chicken fat, and it went over rice. Some grandmothers made gravy so good the chicken was almost incidental. Those grandmothers are gone now, and nobody who learned by watching rather than measuring makes it the same way anymore. The bell peppers came from the garden in late summer when they were thick-walled and sweet, and they became the bowl that made a small amount of ground pork feel like a full meal for six. The filling was rice, meat, onion, black pepper, and garlic, packed into the hollow peppers and set upright in a pan with a little water to prevent scorching. Ground pork was always cheaper than ground beef, and through the 1940s and 50s, it was the standard choice in Black Southern and Midwestern households. Breadcrumbs, soaked in water, sometimes extended the filling further, holding the mixture together without anyone noticing the economy behind it. What came out of the oven looked deliberate. The peppers tender and dark at the edges, the filling dense and savory, the kitchen holding that roasted smell for hours. The ratio of rice to meat to pepper lived in memory, not in any measurement anyone wrote down. Stewed okra and tomatoes sorted a room immediately. You either grew up eating it or you looked at it sideways, and those who looked sideways had simply never had it made right. The okra went into a roux-based pot with tomatoes, onion, and garlic, cooked low and slow until the pods broke down and the sliminess that put off outsiders transformed into a silky, thick sauce. West African cooks had understood okra's thickening properties for centuries before the crop reached the Americas, and that knowledge of cooking past the vegetable's resistance into something smooth and rich was carried into Louisiana Creole cooking by enslaved African women who made it a staple of Black Gulf Coast kitchens. The dish cost almost nothing and stretched over rice. You knew it was done when the okra had surrendered its shape and the pot smelled more of tomato and roux than a vegetable. Most people outside the tradition never waited long enough to reach that moment. The pig ears were the part of the hog the butcher didn't put in the display case, cheap and overlooked, and the grandmothers who knew better cleaned them, boiled them until the cartilage softened, then built a dark roux gravy and let the ears finish in it until every surface was coated and rich. Served on bread, the sandwich was unlike anything made from what most people considered the respectable parts of the pig. The texture had a yielding, almost gelatinous quality from the collagen in the cartilage, and the gravy gave it a depth that a pork chop couldn't match. Smothered pig ears had roots in Creole cooking traditions in Louisiana, where the whole hog philosophy meant nothing was discarded and the most labor-intensive preparations often produced the most complex results. By the 1960s, pig ear sandwiches were sold at lunch counters in Black Southern neighborhoods as everyday food, inexpensive, satisfying, and made with the kind of care that elevated discarded cuts into something people drove across town to eat. If the Depression took one thing from the dessert table, it was the assumption that a pie needed fruit. Vinegar pie arrived to prove that wrong. African American families in the rural South made it through the 1930s and 40s, mixing sugar, flour, butter, water, and apple cider vinegar into a filling that baked into a smooth, slightly tart custard that tasted improbably like lemon. The vinegar performed the chemical work that citrus would have done in a better supplied kitchen, cutting the sweetness, brightening the filling, keeping the custard from going flat. People who tasted it for the first time often asked what kind of fruit was in it, because nothing about the flavor announced substitution or scarcity. A pie built from vinegar and sugar tasted deliberate and considered, not like hardship on a plate. Most people today have never encountered it, and the few recipes that survive in old handwritten books rarely explain what made it work, because the women who made it never needed that explanation written down. The bread pudding started with what was already going stale: heels, leftover biscuits, whatever had gone hard on the counter, torn into a baking dish and soaked in eggs, evaporated milk, sugar, vanilla, and cinnamon until the bread absorbed every drop and swelled soft again. The evaporated milk was the key, shelf-stable, richer than fresh milk, and standard in Black Southern households through the 1940s and 50s when refrigeration wasn't guaranteed. What went into the oven was humble and wet. What came out was warm and dense and custardy, and the whiskey sauce poured over it, butter and sugar, and a shot of whatever was in the cabinet cooked until glossy, turned it into something people remembered for years. This was a New Orleans dessert tradition carried through Black households along the Gulf Coast that never needed a written recipe because the proportions lived in memory. When she was gone, the people who loved her found the bread pudding was the first thing they couldn't replicate. They had watched her make it 100 times. They still couldn't find the right amount of anything. Chicken gizzards were the part of the bird that required the most work and got the least respect. Tough, dense, requiring long braising before they surrendered. Hen, and in most households, they were quietly the cook's private reward, set aside before the rest of the chicken went elsewhere. In the 1950s and 60s, a pound of gizzards cost nearly nothing at the butcher, which meant they appeared regularly in Black Southern kitchens as a weeknight protein nobody glamorized, but everybody ate. The trick was time. You couldn't rush a gizzard. It had to braise low and slow in seasoned stock until the muscle finally relented and the texture became something between tender and chewy that no other part of the chicken could replicate. The brown gravy built from the braising liquid went over rice, and the gizzards sat in it, dark and densely flavored. Children complained about them. Adults ate every last one. And when the grandmothers who braised them every Wednesday stopped cooking, gizzards simply slipped off the weeknight table without anyone quite deciding to stop. Boiled peanuts sorted people by geography as cleanly as anything. You either grew up with them or you didn't understand them at all. Why anyone would boil a perfectly good peanut into something soft and salty made no sense, unless you had stood in a summer kitchen watching a grandmother drop raw peanuts straight from the field into a pot of heavily salted water and leave them there for hours. The tradition was ancient. Ground nuts were cultivated in West Africa long before they reached the Americas, and early documentation from the colonial South placed them in the hands of enslaved people who already knew exactly what to do with them. The finished peanuts were briny and soft all the way through, with the flavor closer to a bean than a nut, because fresh pulled peanuts are legumes and respond to water accordingly. People from outside the tradition called them strange. People from inside reached for another handful before the first was finished. Dried navy bean soup was Monday. Not exciting, not something anyone wrote home about, but so reliably present through childhood that its absence later in life left a specific kind of quiet. In many Black households through the 1940s and 50s, Monday was wash day, which meant the stove needed something that could cook itself all morning without attention. A pot of dried navy beans with onion, a smoked ham hock, and enough water to cover went on first thing and cooked while the laundry ran. The smell of that pot, slow, faintly smoky, warm with pork and onion, was Monday. By supper, the beans had gone creamy and the broth had thickened on its own. Cornbread came alongside. The hock sat in the center of the pot, and whoever pulled the most meat off it at the table was doing well for themselves. Nobody gave it a name, it was just beans. The woman who made it is gone, and the kitchen that smelled like that on Mondays is gone with her, and no recipe brings that smell back. The leftover cornmeal mush went into a pan to set overnight, poured hot and thick, smooth flat, left to firm into something that could be sliced clean. The next morning it came out in cold slabs, went into a skillet of hot grease, and fried until the outside crisped gold, while the inside stayed soft and warm. Drizzled with cane syrup or sorghum, it tasted nothing like the mush it had started as. Frying transformed the texture entirely, giving it a crackling surface that carried the sweetness in a way fresh cooked cornmeal never could. In Black Southern households from the 1930s onward, this was the standard use for leftover grits. Waste nothing, transform everything, turn yesterday's side into today's breakfast. People who grew up eating it could identify the sound of those slabs hitting hot grease before they were fully awake. That sound meant morning. The soda crackers came out of the sleeve, the cane syrup came down from the shelf, and that was dessert, or it was an after-school snack, or it was what appeared at the end of a meal when there was nothing left to bake. Cane syrup was cheaper than refined sugar and more versatile, thick and amber dark, made from sugarcane juice, boiled down slowly in operations that had run across the rural South since long before the Civil War. You poured it over the crackers and let it seep in until the edges softened while the center stayed crisp. The combination was sweet and salty, and satisfying in the way that only things eaten in a particular kitchen with a particular person are, never again quite right anywhere else. Most people who remember it remember a grandmother producing it wordlessly, placing it on the table without ceremony. You were there, and the syrup was there, and that was the whole thing. The chicken backs and necks went into the pot because they cost the least and yielded the most, not meat exactly, but flavor that no breast or thigh could match, rendered out slowly into a broth that turned rich and golden over an afternoon. During the Depression years and through the lean decades that followed, Black households bought these cuts specifically because they were cheap, and they cooked them specifically because generations of kitchen knowledge had made it clear that the bones held more than the butcher thought they did. The backs went in first with onion, celery, garlic, and a bay leaf, covered with water and left to simmer until the house smelled like Sunday, even on a Wednesday. The small amount of meat that came off those backs and necks was tender and deeply flavored, folded back into the broth with rice or egg noodles to make a full meal from what had started as a collection of bones. The broth was the transformation from water and scraps to something silky and sustaining, the kind of pot that could quiet a sick child, warm a cold house, and stretch whatever else was on the table into enough. Succotash carried centuries behind it, a dish born from an indigenous Narragansett word for a corn and bean preparation that predated European contact. Black Southern cooks absorbed it, adapted it, and added salt pork, which turned the mild combination of corn and lima beans into something savory enough to serve as a main. The salt pork went in first, rendered until golden at the edges, and the corn and beans cooked in that fat and took on its smokiness. Through the 1940s and 50s, this dish appeared on Black family tables in the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic South, where corn and field peas grew nearby and salt pork was always in the house. You never added the corn and beans at the same time. The beans went in first because they needed more cooking, and the corn followed late, staying sweet and distinct. If you added them together, the corn turned soft and lost itself in the pot. That sequencing was the technique, and nobody wrote it down because nobody needed to. The watermelon rind was the part everyone left on the plate, and it was exactly what got saved. After the fruit was eaten, the thick white layer between the red flesh and the green skin got cut away, trimmed, and went into a brine of sugar, vinegar, and spices, cloves, cinnamon, sometimes a little ginger, to cure in jars through summer and into fall. The tradition had direct roots in West African preservation practices, where vegetable and fruit scraps were pickled rather than discarded, and it took hold in enslaved communities in the antebellum South as both a practical use of garden waste and a form of self-sufficiency. The finished rind was sweet and tangy and translucent, served as a condiment alongside meat or something to eat cold straight from the jar. By the 1960s, jars of pickled watermelon rind were still being made in Black households that had moved north, carrying the taste of a particular yard to a kitchen that no longer looked like home. Those jars carried summer north, but what got the family through winter mornings was simpler than any preserved thing. Fried salt pork with pan gravy, thick slabs of salt-cured pork fat sliced from the block, patted dry, and laid into a dry skillet to render and crisp until the edges browned and the center stayed tender. The fat that came off in the pan was the gravy, worked with flour and a splash of water until it thickened into something pale and smooth that went over grits or biscuits or whatever starch was ready first. Through the 1930s and 40s, salt pork was among the cheapest proteins in the rural South, sold from barrels at country stores and bought by the pound by black families who needed a fat and a flavoring and a meal all at once. It was not glamorous. It was not saved for company. It was Tuesday morning, and it was what got you out the door. The grandmothers who made it are gone now, and the block of salt pork at the country store is gone with them, and nobody thinks to fry it anymore. The meatless black-eyed pea soup appeared during the lean stretches when there wasn't even a ham hock to spare. Just dried peas, onion, garlic, salt, pepper, and water, cooked low until the peas softened and the broth turned cloudy and thick with starch. What it lacked in pork, it made up for in time. A pot that had been on the stove for 3 hours tasted different from a pot on for 1, and the grandmothers who made it understood that the hours were the ingredient. Black-eyed peas carried symbolic weight on New Year's Day in African American households, a tradition documented through Black Southern foodways back to West African customs of eating them for blessing and prosperity. But on ordinary Tuesdays, they were simply the pot that kept the house going. The woman who watched that pot is somewhere it can't be followed, and the quiet in these kitchens, where it once simmered, is the kind that doesn't fill back up. Time equals 1 second / greater than peanut soup was one of the oldest dishes in the African American culinary record. Roasted peanuts, ground to a paste, cooked into a rich broth with onion and celery, strained smooth and seasoned simply. The dish traced directly back to West African groundnut stews, brought to Virginia by enslaved Africans who had cooked with groundnuts for generations before the crop was ever called a peanut. By the 18th century, peanut soup was documented in Virginia plantation kitchens, cooked by enslaved women whose names were rarely recorded, but whose technique shaped Southern cooking for the next 2 centuries. In Black households, it never required formal preparation, just peanuts, a pot, patience, and the understanding that a humble roasted legume coaxed with enough heat and time could produce a broth as deep as anything made from bone. The dish faded from most tables by the 1970s, displaced by faster meals. The women who made it from memory are gone. The technique lives mostly in Virginia, historical records now. Nobody taught you in words, you watched. She wiped the inside of the cast iron skillet with a folded piece of wax paper rubbed in lard, turning it in a slow circle that left the film thin enough to be invisible, but thick enough to matter, and she did this every single time, not because the pan was dirty, but because the iron needed to be prepared before it would cooperate with whatever came next. The skillet itself had been in the kitchen longer than anyone could remember, seasoned over decades into a surface so smooth it had become something a new pan from any store has never successfully replicated. You never used soap on it. You dried it over heat. You stored it with the lid slightly open. These were the rules that lived in the hands of the women who kept them, passed by watching and repetition. Most of those women are gone. Most of their skillets are still in someone's cabinet, dark and cold and waiting for someone who still knows what to do with them. The rice pudding came at the end of the week, made from whatever rice was left in the pot, reheated with evaporated milk, sugar, a pinch of nutmeg, and sometimes raisins, cooked slowly until the milk thickened around the rice and set into something creamy and warm. Evaporated milk was the constant, shelf-stable, richer than fresh, available even when nothing else was. Through the 1940s and into the 60s, this was a Sunday evening ritual in Black Southern homes that had made do all week and rewarded themselves quietly at the end of it. It smelled like vanilla and warm sugar, and it tasted like the end of a long week going soft. Most people who remember it remember a specific bowl in a specific kitchen, held by hands that are no longer here to hold anything. There was always a last pot, even if no one knew it was the last one at the time. She made something, beans, maybe, or a pot of greens, or whatever was in the kitchen that needed to be used. And it went on the stove the way it always had, without ceremony, without anyone watching closely or asking what she was doing with her hands. The knowledge was in the motion. It was in the angle of the spoon and the moment she turned the heat down and the way she tasted and corrected without measuring anything at all. When that pot came off the stove for the last time, it took all of that with it. What these 30 dishes share is not a recipe. It's the woman behind it, the one who learned from the woman before her, who learned from the woman before her, a chain of kitchen knowledge that stretched back through migration and hardship and survival to something that no cookbook was ever consulted to produce. The pot is still there. She is not. That is the loss. Fried pork chops with sawmill gravy was breakfast royalty in Black Southern households. Thin-cut chops were seasoned heavily with salt and pepper, dredged in flour, and fried until the coating turned crispy. The treasure came from what remained in the pan afterward. Mothers added flour to hot drippings, stirring until it browned slightly and smelled of toasted nuttiness. Milk was poured in slowly, whisked until it transformed into thick, peppery gravy. This gravy was ladled over chops and split biscuits, creating plates so rich that children cleaned every crumb. The combination of crispy pork, creamy gravy, and tender biscuits sustained workers through long mornings and gave children energy for school. It cost almost nothing, but delivered pure luxury that made ordinary mornings feel like celebrations.
White beans with fatback were the slow-cooked winter miracle that kept Black families fed long before money ever showed up in the house. A small piece of fatback was enough to transform a plain pot of beans into something thick, smoky, and full of the kind of flavor that made you close your eyes for a second. Beans were cheap and dependable, stretching across multiple days when they needed to, which was most winters in the 1970s. Mothers would rinse the beans, pick out the broken ones, and drop them into a heavy pot with water, onions, and that precious slab of pork that melted down as the hours passed. The kitchen would smell warm and familiar, like hope simmering even when the world outside felt harsh. Kids knew beans meant full bellies, and they were thankful for that, even if they did not always say it. Served over rice or with cornbread, the beans thickened as they cooled, becoming even better the next day. Fatback was cheap, but its flavor made the whole meal feel bigger and deeper. This was the kind of food that did not just feed you once. It lingered, warmed, and strengthened. It tasted like survival learned across generations.
Ash cakes were the bread of necessity, baked directly in hot coals when no proper oven or skillet was available. Black families mixed coarse cornmeal with water and salt, shaped the dough into flat cakes, wrapped them in dampened corn husks, and buried them in the hot ashes of the hearth. The leaves protected the dough while surrounding heat baked it slowly into dense, smoky bread with distinctive charred flavor. This method required no fuel beyond what was already burning, no equipment beyond hands, and no ingredients beyond basic staples. Enslaved people and sharecroppers relied on ash cakes when they had nothing else, creating sustenance from fire and cornmeal alone. The cakes were filling and portable, perfect for carrying to fields or eating cold the next morning. This ancient method connected Black families to African traditions. Baked pork chops with rice was the weeknight miracle that freed mothers from standing over hot stoves while still delivering meals that tasted like hours of effort. Seasoned pork chops were laid over uncooked rice in a baking dish, then covered with cream of mushroom soup diluted with water. As the dish baked, the rice absorbed all the liquid and flavors from the meat, becoming tender and savory. The chops cooked to perfection on top, edges caramelized where they met the bubbling sauce. This one-dish meal meant fewer pots to wash and more time for helping with homework or other household tasks. Children loved the creamy rice that clung to the chops, and fathers appreciated coming home to hot meals requiring nothing more than setting the table. Efficiency and comfort married together in a single casserole.
Cabbage and smoked sausage skillet was the kind of dish that proved you could take almost nothing and turn it into something that fed a whole house without anyone feeling shortchanged. Cabbage was cheap, one of the cheapest vegetables in the store, and it filled a pot in a way almost nothing else could. Mothers would slice it thin, toss it into a skillet with a little oil, and stretch one single sausage link so far that every person at the table swore they got a piece. The smell of cabbage hitting the pan was unmistakable, sharp at first, but softening as it cooked down into something sweet and cozy. The sausage added just enough smoke to trick the mind into thinking the meal was richer than it really was. Kids would hover, waiting for the moment when the cabbage wilted just enough to match the shine of the sausage pieces. It was simple, hearty, and warm, and it filled bowls in a way that lasted through the night. In the winter, when money was tight and the weather felt unfriendly, this skillet kept people going. It tasted like thrift turned into comfort, like a mother's hands doing quiet miracles with whatever she had. It was everyday food that remembered its purpose well.
Fatback and greens represented the backbone of survival cooking in Black households across the rural South. Fatback, the thick slab of fat from a pig's back, cost almost nothing because butchers considered it undesirable waste. Black cooks knew better, understanding that this pure pork fat could transform bitter greens into something rich and satisfying. The fatback was sliced thin and rendered slowly in cast iron until the fat melted and edges crisped. Greens were added to this flavorful base and simmered for hours until tender, absorbing every bit of smoky richness. This dish provided essential calories and vitamins when fresh meat was unaffordable, keeping families healthy through winters when gardens lay dormant. The greens offered iron while the fat gave sustained energy for long days of labor. Pork chops and cabbage proved Black mothers could make a dollar stretch further than anyone thought possible. Thick-cut chops were browned until they developed deep golden crust, then nestled into beds of sliced cabbage, onions, and carrots, seasoned with salt and smoked paprika. Everything simmered together in covered pots, the cabbage softening and sweetening as it absorbed rendered pork fat. The result was tender vegetables that tasted almost buttery despite having little added fat, surrounding chops that remained juicy from slow cooking. A head of cabbage cost nearly nothing and could feed an army when paired with meat. This dish appeared on tables throughout the week, reheated and somehow tasting even better as flavors continued developing overnight. It was poverty transformed into abundance through skill and patience. Red bean porridge was a humble bowl of sustenance that stretched a handful of dried beans into meals for an entire week. Black families soaked red beans overnight, then simmered them slowly with onion and garlic until the beans broke down into thick, creamy mush. The porridge was served hot over rice or with cornbread, providing complete protein that rivaled expensive meat. This dish traced its roots to West African cooking traditions, where beans and grains formed the foundation of daily meals. During the Depression, red bean porridge kept children fed when grocery money ran short. Mothers added a small piece of salt pork when possible, stretching the meat's flavor through the entire batch. The porridge could be reheated for days, growing thicker and more flavorful with each warming. Smothered pork chops with onion gravy was the Sunday dinner that brought entire families rushing to the table before the blessing was finished. Black mothers seasoned bone-in chops with salt, pepper, and garlic powder, dredged them in flour, and browned them golden in cast iron. The magic came when sliced onions were added to the drippings and cooked until soft and sweet. Broth was poured in to create thick, savory gravy that bubbled as the chops simmered beneath it. The meat became so tender it fell off the bone, soaking up every drop of that silky sauce. Served over rice or mashed potatoes, this dish stretched one package of pork chops into a feast that fed six with seconds to spare. Children would sop up the last of the gravy with bread, unwilling to let a single drop go to waste. These kitchens went quiet and they took their secrets with them. Like and subscribe if these flavors still live in your memory